Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Empire loves pumping up propaganda about how invincible its military forces are. I mean, everything from the bucket heads to the goose stepping to the triangular shaped city-sized starships are designed to instill a sense of awe and fear in the Empire's might. And while the Empire was truly one of the largest and most formidable military forces in the galaxy, in a lot of ways, this was a military force that favored form over actual function. We've made countless videos about the problems with Imperial training and their culture in all the various branches of the armed forces, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, so we won't go too much into detail about that, but the result is a military force that is all bluster and very little substance. The result is the Imperial military is full of glory-chasing morons, incapable offspring of the elite, and straight-up psychopathic murdering monsters who are really just not a good fit for the military. Plus, the Imperial military, despite its massive size, was already spread thin. Most sectors were undermanned and underpatrolled, especially when you got to the mid-rim and started heading outwards. And so the Empire needed capable and resourceful officers who were able to solve all of the various problems the Empire faced. But instead, we got military forces that were arrogant, ill-disciplined, and oftentimes unnecessarily cruel and dismissive of the local population's needs, which only created more problems. As a result, the readiness of most Imperial units was quite poor, and their ability to react to threats was quite delayed, especially in the early years of the Galactic Civil War when attacks were sporadic and usually quite small-scale hit-and-run types of operations. The Empire was extremely weak at responding to these type of threats, and this hole in their defenses would be ruthlessly exploited by the mobile and tenacious rebel forces all across the galaxy, leading to the Rebel Alliance's greatest victories of the war. Today we'll be talking about 4 different incidents where the Empire forgot to deploy the garrison, and as a result, the Rebel Alliance won victories that they had no right to win. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Delete Me. Are you guys tired of scam messages, advertisements, and now political donation requests all being beamed into your text, messaging apps, email, landlines, dreams, and regular mail? Like, how do all of these randos get your information? Well, there's actually an entire industry of data brokers where your information is getting sold to various entities, including some very sketchy and potentially malicious actors. This is not only annoying, but could also potentially lead to identity theft and you becoming a target of phishing scams. As someone with an online presence and many aquatic enemies, I use Delete Me to remove my information from data broker websites. The process is quite simple, and you'll get regular reports as Delete Me scours the internet and does its work. When I received my first report from them, they removed my information from 65 listings. They even listed which individual data brokers they contacted. Delete Me even has a family plan that can protect your loved ones as well, because data brokers also sell information about who your relatives are. What a world we live in. If you guys are interested in using Delete Me, click on the QR code on screen or check out the link in the description below and use our promo code GTECH, that's all caps, for a 20% discount. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. The Imperial military operation in Scarif is a great example of everything wrong with the Empire. This was an extremely important archive and research base for the Imperial military, but because of the sensitive nature of the activities happening on the base, Palpatine had it built in the Outer Rim as far away from the Imperial Senate as possible, which shows us just how paranoid and lacking of trust Palpatine was for his own legislature, which essentially was a rubber-stamped Congress by this point. Scarif's remoteness and secretive nature meant that there was a relatively small fleet guarding this planet, consisting of just 2 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. That might seem robust, but many of the Empire's most important projects were kept on this planet. I guess the idea was to not draw too much attention to the planet. And so instead, guarding the world was a massive shield projected by a Golan M3185 space station, an engineering marvel in its own right. With so much sensitive information on this planet and with relatively few defensive assets, one would think that the discipline of the units on Scarif would be top-notch, and in many ways, it was, at least on paper. Like a lot of things in the Empire. Scarif was staffed by so-called elite forces, some of the best officers in the entire fleet. But one must ask themselves, what does that actually mean in a military force that's seen very little combat in real action and is notorious for its corruption? Well, it turns out the type of personnel actually deployed on Scarif were those in line for retirement. These were officers who had done everything right in their career, kissed up to the right commanding officers, stuff like that. I mean, take a look at how beautiful this tropical paradise is with its white sand beaches and turquoise waters. This was a place that put you at ease. This is a place where you go to relax. Its remoteness also meant that this garrison almost never encountered any threats because no one actually knew it existed. When Director Orson Krennic, a civilian director with the Imperial Military Department of Advanced Weapons Research, came for a visit, the local garrison was visibly shaken by the appearance of such an important official.
What brings you to Scarif?
Galen Urso, I want every dispatch, every transmission he has ever sent called up for inspection.
All of them?
Yes, all of them. Get started.
You know, Pudgy over here is actually General Sotoris Ramda, the commander of the Scarif deployment. The planetary shield over Scarif was so powerful, Ramda basically viewed his job as redundant and unnecessary. Therefore, he was quite a relaxed individual, and that attitude spread to his officers and the men. With the wrong leadership in place when Rogue One decided to launch its daring raid on Scarif's Citadel installation and set off a series of distraction explosions around the base, here was the Scarif garrison's command's reaction.
Blind! Deploy the garrison! Move!
This is just not a good sign. I mean, Director Krennic is a freaking civilian, guys. He's not even in the military command chain, and he has to wake these buffoons up. Not only did the gate team fail to detect the initial landing party when an entire rebel fleet appeared out of hyperspace in support of that mission, another costly delay to close the shield gate and scramble the TIE fighters allows a small rebel contingent to squeeze through that gate. I timed them. It takes them about a minute to 10 seconds from detecting the rebel fleet to actually closing the gate. It could actually be longer because, movies kind of fast forward time a little bit, but this is all because the commander of the shield gate had to talk to his superior before closing the gates.
Those are rebel ships! Get Admiral Gordon, immediately!
You think the Empire, which during this time period was plagued by rebel hit-and-run attacks, would have developed some kind of protocol that allowed gate commanders to make decisions by themselves in these types of scenarios. That should really cut down the reaction time of this gate crew from a minute and 10 seconds to just 10 seconds, which would prevent those crucial rebel reinforcements from landing on Scarif and supporting the ground forces just enough so that they can be successful with their mission. One could argue if the shield gate had closed quickly enough and denied access to these rebels, Rogue One's attempt to steal the Death Star plans would have failed, leading to further failures in the next major skirmish we'll be talking about at Yavin 4. Now, the Scarif deployment, all things considered, was slightly reasonable. I mean, a minute and 10-second reaction time isn't exactly terrible. But what is horrible is how idiotic the Death Star's course of actions were during the Battle of Yavin, which followed Scarif. After finding the rebel base on Yavin 4, Grand Moff will have Tarkin sets his sight on destroying the entire moon the base is located on. When the Death Star arrives in system, it's basically blocked by the giant gas planet that Yavin 4 revolves around. And so the Death Star has to maneuver around, and this becomes a battle of time for the rebels. Or so Tarkin thought. Tarkin had seen what the Death Star could do to planets like Jedha and Scarif, and so now he was supremely confident that it was just a matter of time the rebels would be wiped out in a similar manner. Despite personally seeing the rebels' desperate attack on Scarif and knowing about the retrieval of some type of sensitive data, despite being warned about the potential flaws in the Death Star, Tarkin doesn't even deploy the literally thousands of TIE fighters on board of the Death Star when the rebels launched their own attack. I mean, they basically could have destroyed the entire rebel fighter group before they even got close to the battle station. The Battle of Yavin should have ended with relatively little fanfare, with Luke Skywalker dying on his first deployment, surrounded by, hundreds of TIE fighters. They should have been outnumbered at least 20-1. But no, Tarkin, ever arrogant, refuses to believe that rebels pose a threat, even when it becomes quickly apparent that the Death Star's point defense weapons are inadequate at stopping snub fighters. Ultimately, it's Darth Vader who makes the command to deploy the TIE fighters, not Tarkin.
We'll have to destroy them ship to ship, get the crews to their fighters.
And even when Tarkin is warned that the rebels are targeting a potential weak spot in the Death Star, he refuses to leave his station, and that kind of seals his fate.
We've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. Should I have your ship standing by?
Evacuate? In our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances.
It wasn't just large military installations where the Empire was lacking. This wasn't just a problem that was isolated to specific garrisons because of individual flaws and arrogance. There was a culture of stupidity and just an overall lack of discipline and training that was pervasive across the entire fleet. Take, for example, the interdiction of Luthen Rael's Fondor Hallcraft. Luthen Rael was one of the main players in the early rebellion. He was the central figure in what was known as the Axis Cell, a very important rebel unit that focused on acquiring resources and unifying the various rebel movements into a more coherent manner. During one trip to Segramilo, Luthen Rael meets with Saw Gerrera, the leader of the extremely violent Partisans in the Cavern Angels X-Wing Squadron. While leaving the planet, the ship was stopped by Segramilo's Imperial patrol. This was by chance, by the way, and, capturing Luthen Rael was just a big stroke of luck. Luthen Rael was slipping a little bit. He was a little bit too focused on juggling too many different personas and things. And honestly, usually these kind of dragnets that the Empire throws out there don't work. But in this case, it actually did work. They caught the person they really needed to catch. Now, this Imperial patrol consisted of a Cantwell-class arrestor cruiser and its air wing. And the commander of this patrol, Captain Elk, fully knew how dangerous the area was.
Is there something wrong, Patrol?
There's been partisan activity in the area. This is a piracy zone.
Oh, thank you for the warning. I'll be careful.
The Partisans were a well-known entity by this point. They had been fighting the Empire since the rise of the Empire. They were extremely vicious and also effective in their tactics, and so the fact that this patrol was just flying around with a relatively fragile cruiser without its combat patrol deployed is just a sign of Imperial ineptitude. And when the Fondor Hallcraft is seized by the Cantwell's tractor beam, for one reason or another, the ship is not prepared for the countermeasures that Luthen Rael launches at its main tractor beam. Luthen Rael does have a James Bond moment, like Ashton Martin deploying the tacks from the back of the trunk, but this is the Cantwell Arrestor class cruiser. It's a military ship. It has layers of defenses. It should be able to minimize any kind of threat such a small freighter can pose to it. The Cantwell-class Arrestor cruiser has ion cannons which can disable ships. More importantly, it has 2 squadrons of TIE fighters on board that should have been deployed and been used to first intercept suspect starships. The tractor beam then can be fired from further away to, halt the movement of freighters, but why would you ever let a suspected ship gets so close to your cruiser? And it's just a bad move. These type of procedures need to be developed so that such incidents like this never happen. The Cantwell-class Arrestor cruiser is a very formidable ship, but it has a gigantic dish on the front of it, which is quite vulnerable, and I think the designers of this ship needed to talk to the actual people who were running it to develop the right type of doctrine. Had the Empire actually captured Luthen Rael successfully, it would have been a huge blow to the early rebellion and delayed the overall rebel movement for many years. During the Battle of Hoth, the Galactic Empire managed to surprise the rebel troops stationed on Echo Base. This was the command center of the entire rebel movement, and even though Kendall Oswald's blunder gave the rebel forces a few minutes warning so that they can begin evacuation, the Empire was still in a position to intercept the enemy force. With a massive fleet arrayed in orbit around the planet, and a combined complement of thousands of TIE fighters, for some reason, Vader's Death Squadron failed to deploy their TIE fighters in a blockade, and relied mainly on Star Destroyers to stop rebel forces from escaping the planet. As a result, the rebels on Hoth were able to escape on relatively slow and lightly armed transports that were only being escorted by X-Wings. These ships were just about fast enough to evade turbo lasers from a Star Destroyer, but they would have been ripped apart had the Empire deployed more TIE fighters, which is the theme for this entire video. Instead, the Imperial fleet focused on the ground assault of Echo Base, and most fighter assets were sent to provide air cover for the advancing formation of Imperial walkers. This ultimately allows a good percentage of the rebel personnel on Echo Base to escape and fight another day, but making this ultimately a Pyrrhic victory for the rebels, but a victory nonetheless. It should be noted that before the battle even started, Vader did kill the commanding officer of his fleet, Kendall Oswald, which led to a battlefield promotion. It is very likely that this added to the confusion and ineptitude of Imperial forces operating that day, who once again forgot to deploy all of their assets to fight the rebellion. I think the lesson here is that no matter how much stronger you believe you are compared to your enemy, it's always good to deploy all of your assets and, don't take anything for granted. Deploy your fighters, deploy them early, and end the fight against an Imperial enemy as soon as possible, even if it is a bunch of Tusken Raiders firing at your Star Destroyer with the cycler rifles. Because in war, it's always important to not underestimate your foes. Your life could depend on it. And judging by how Poe Dameron is able to dismantle the entire point defense weapon system on an 8-kilometer long First Order siege dreadnought during the evacuation of Dakar, it seems like the First Order also hasn't learned this extremely important lesson. And so, as Orson Krennic once wisely said on Scarif, are we blind? Deploy the garrison. Thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. Check them out in the description down below, and don't forget to use our 20% discount code.